I have sat at the bedside of 3 dying pastors. What they confessed to me destroyed my faith for 2 years. 3 things that were said to me that I have never, until today, repeated to another living person. The first pastor told me about a decision he made at 19 years old. A decision that explained every miracle he performed for 30 years. And that left one question that he carried to his grave. A question that I still cannot answer. The second pastor told me about a member of his congregation, a man who sat in the 3rd row every Sunday for 5 years, a man who on one Wednesday morning did something no human being can do. And the third pastor only said one sentence after 84 years of life and 50 years of ministry. And that sentence is the reason I left chaplaincy work for almost 2 years. And today, I'm going to take you into each of those rooms, show you exactly what I saw, exactly what was said to me. Let's begin with the first pastor. We will call him Pastor Addo. His bed was bed 14, the first room on the 4th floor. He had performed miracles for 30 years. In his final hours, he told me exactly where the powers came from, and it was not where his congregation taught. I visited him every morning. For 5 days, he was pleasant and brief. On the 6th morning, I arrived to find him already awake, staring at the ceiling, hands folded over his chest. The room was quiet except for the slow beeping of the heart monitor. A nurse had just stepped out to take a phone call in the hallway. Pastor Addo watched the door close behind her. Then he looked at me in a way I had never seen before. Not like a preacher, like a man carrying something heavy. He motioned with his hand, closed the door. I thought he wanted privacy to pray. But when I shut the door, he lowered his voice, almost a whisper. His hands were trembling slightly against the hospital blanket. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said, "What I need to say, I will only say once, and I need someone to say it too before I go." There is something I have never told anyone in 30 years of ministry. He swallowed slowly before speaking again. My church did not grow the way people think it did. He turned his head towards the window like he was making sure no one else could hear. Then he said the words quietly. It began with a covenant. At first, I thought he was talking about prayer, but the next thing he told me made me realize he wasn't. He began not with the hospital, not with his ministry. He began in 1974 in a marketplace where he was 19 years old and so poor that the word poor does not contain it. His father had worked himself into an early grave for wages that barely fed the family. His mother prayed every night with a faith so total it broke his heart, and then woke up every morning to the same crushing reality. He had decided something at 19. He had decided that prayer alone was not going to be fast enough for the life he intended to live. And in that marketplace that year, not in a church, not in a spiritual setting, an older man approached him. The man said he had been watching him, that he saw a gift, a capacity for influence that most people never develop. He said he could help him access that gift, not to replace God. He was carefully to say, just accelerate what God had already placed inside him. So, this man ended up inviting Addo to a gathering. And Addo actually went. He told me what happened at the gathering, and he told me what he had signed. And he said, I need you to understand. It did not feel like paper. The truth is, he did not tell me everything that happened at the gathering. His breathing was difficult, and some of it he could not find words for. But he told me the essential thing. He said he made an agreement at 19 years old, desperate and hungry for something real. He agreed to terms he did not fully understand in a room full of power he had never felt in any church. He said it felt more present than God had ever felt, more immediate, more certain. He signed something, and he said, and he repeated this twice so I would not miss it. It did not feel like paper. I don't know what it was, but it was not paper. From that year, 1974, everything in his life accelerated. He began his ministry at the age of 21. His preaching began to carry a power he had not possessed before. People fell under the sound of his voice, even before he had finished his first sentence. The sick were healed when he touched them. His reputation spread faster than any natural explanation could account for. He built a church, then a larger church, then a movement. 30 years, thousands of converts, healing that made doctors couldn't explain. And through all of it, every Sunday, every crusade, every prayer line, every hand laid on every sick body, he kept his agreement. I asked him what the agreement required. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at the ceiling and said, every year, something that cost me something real. Sometimes money, sometimes a relationship. Once, only once, something I cannot say out loud. Not even now, not even here. I did not push him on that one thing. Some things a dying man is entitled to keep. What came next was the moment that has never left me. He turned from the ceiling and looked directly at me with eyes that were completely clear, completely present. And he said, the miracles were real. I need you to understand that. The people were genuinely healed. I have prayed about this for 30 years. How that is possible, given what I know about where the power came from. I have never received an answer. And that silence from God on that one question has been heavier than everything else combined. He closed his eyes. Then he said, tell them to test the fruit more carefully than they test the miracle. A miracle can come from anywhere, but fruit, real fruit, only grows from one source. Tell them that. He died 4 days later. His church prayed over him as he went. By every account, it was peaceful. But in those final 4 days, between our conversation and his last breath, I watched something happen to his face that I have never seen on another dying person. It was not peace. It was not fear. It was relief. The relief of a man who has finally, after 30 years, put down something extraordinarily heavy. I sat there for a long time after that conversation, trying to process what I had just heard. But the truth is, that was only the first confession. The second pastor I spoke to would reveal something even darker. And at that time, I had no idea that the third conversation would disturb me the most. I carried Pastor Addo's confession for 3 years. I told myself different things about it on different days. Some days I believed him completely. Some days I told myself it was a dying man mythologizing his own past. I could never decide which version I needed to be true. And then, 3 years later, I found myself sitting across from another pastor, a man whose ministry had once drawn thousands. From the outside, his church looked successful. And this pastor's confession made Pastor Addo's own to feel like a gentle introduction, because what he told me was not about a decision he made. It was about something that came to him, something that walked through his church doors one Sunday morning and sat in the third row for 5 years before he understood what it was. He was 58 years old and had been in ministry for 26 years. People spoke about his church the way they spoke about a rare and beautiful thing. The members were unusually devoted, unusually prosperous, unusually connected to one another. Visitors who came for the first time described the same thing independently without having spoken to each other. A warmth, not the warmth of good people in a good community, though that was there too. Something underneath that, something that made you feel the moment you walked through the doors, you were being welcomed by something that had been expecting you. Pastor Kevin had always taken quiet pride in this. He believed God had given him a special grace to build community. He was not entirely wrong about the grace. He was completely wrong about the source. He came to the hospital with a brain condition that had been progressing silently for years. Surgery was not an option. He was given weeks. When I met him, he was still sharp. He sat up in the bed and shook my hand and looked at me with eyes that were completely clear. He said, "I have been waiting for someone like you. I believe God sent you specifically because what I need to say cannot go with me. It is too important to be buried. Please sit down and do not be afraid of what I am about to tell you." His church had grown naturally for the first 8 years. Steady, organic, real. Then in the 9th year, on an ordinary Sunday morning with no warning or announcement, a new family came through the doors. A man, a woman, 2 children, well-dressed, quiet. They sat in the third row from the front, slightly left off center. They came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that and every Sunday after that without exception for the next 5 years. The man, Pastor Kevin called him Brother Joseph, became one of the most faithful members he had ever encountered in 30 years of ministry. He served in every capacity the church offered. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He gave generously without being asked. He prayed with a fervor that moved other members to tears. And from the Sunday that family arrived, the church began to change. In 5 years, his congregation tripled. His members prospered in ways that surprised even themselves. People who had never been interested in church walked through his doors as if something had called them. And every single change, every single one, began the Sunday that family sat down in the third row. For 5 years, Pastor Kevin accepted this as God's blessing. Then one Wednesday morning, for a reason he could not fully explain, something had simply pulled him there before sunrise. He arrived at the church very early. He let himself in through the back entrance. And in the main hall, in the darkness before dawn, he saw Brother Joseph. Brother Joseph was standing in his usual spot, third row, slightly left off center. His back was to the door. He did not hear Pastor Kevin enter. And Pastor Kevin stood in the shadows of the doorway and watched. For nearly 10 minutes, he watched. He told me he struggled more with describing this than with anything else in his life. He said languages was not built for what he needed to say. The closest he could come was this. He was not praying. He was not standing still. He was doing something I have no word for. The movement was wrong. The stillness was wrong. The air around him was different. I could feel it from the doorway. And I knew with every part of me that what was standing in my church that morning had never, in its entire existence, been a man. He said he backed out of the building without making a sound. He went home. He did not sleep. He spent the entire day in the most desperate prayer of his life. The following Sunday, he waited. Brother Joseph arrived at his usual time, sat in his usual seat, smiled his usual smile. And Pastor Kelvin, from the pulpit, began to pray in a way he had never prayed in public. Not a performance, not a crafted sermon, something raw, direct, aimed specifically at whatever had been sitting in that third row for 5 years. Brother Joseph stood up in the middle of the service. He looked at Pastor Kevin for a long moment. Then he walked out. The family was never seen again. No forwarding address, no goodbye, as if they had never existed at all. At the end of his confession, after everything he had told me, Pastor Kevin did not ask me to pray for him. He asked me one question. He said, "Do you think what it brought was real? The growth, the prosperity, the warmth, the life that genuinely changed inside those walls, was any of it real? Or was all of it just bait? Was my entire ministry just a mechanism for something to feed on my congregation for 5 years?" I did not have an answer. I told him honestly, I do not know. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. Then he said something that I have thought about every single day since that room. That is the punishment. Not knowing. 30 years of ministry, and I cannot draw a clean line between what was God and what was something in the third row, counting my congregation like livestock. That not knowing is the thing I am most afraid to bring before God. He died weeks later, peacefully, his family told me. I have never been able to look at a full church congregation the same way since. After Pastor Kevin, I requested leave. I was not given it. I continued. I visited the sick. I prayed with the dying. I held hands and read scriptures and did what I was trained to do. But I was doing it differently now. I was doing it like a man who has looked behind a door he cannot unlook behind. 2 years passed, and then I was assigned to an old man at the end of the East Corridor. 84 years old, 50 years of ministry, a small quiet church that had never sought fame. His family said he had been asking for a chaplain for 4 days, that he had refused to speak to his own children about whatever was on his mind, that he was waiting for someone specific. I sat down next to Pastor Samuel, and he looked at me for a long time before he spoke. And then he said something that told me immediately this was the one I had been sent for. This was the confession that was going to cost me everything. Pastor Samuel was the stillest person I have ever sat with in 11 years of chaplaincy. Not calm, not peaceful. Still, the way very deep water is still. The kind of stillness that has weight and history and things living inside it that never come to the surface. He had led the same small church for 50 years, 120 members, roughly the same number for 5 decades. He had never sought growth, never appeared on television, never held crusades or recorded sermons. People in the wider church community knew of him the way you know of a very old tree, present, rooted, quietly significant in a way that is almost impossible to explain. I sat down and he looked at me for a very long time. Then he said, "You have done this before with men like me. I can see what it has cost you. That means you can carry what I am going to give you." Unlike the other two, he did not begin with a confession. He began with a question. He asked me what I had learned in all my years at bedsides about the relationship between a life and its ending. I told him what I believed, that death strips away the performance, that most people at the end return to what is most essential in them. He listened carefully, then he said, "Yes, that is exactly what I am afraid of." I asked him what he meant. He was quiet, long enough that I thought he had fallen asleep. Then he spoke about his 50 years. Not the miracles, not the successes, those he barely mentioned. He spoke about the weight of being a symbol, about a particular loneliness of a life lived as a representation of something rather than as a person. About the gap, and he called it a physical sensation, like a hollow space behind his sternum, between who he was required to be on Sunday mornings and who he actually was every other hour of every other day. He spoke for almost 40 minutes. I did not interrupt once, and then he stopped and looked at the window, and I waited. When he turned back to me, something had changed in his face. The stillness was still there, but underneath it, I could see the expression of a man who has spent 50 years keeping a door closed and had finally decided to open it just once, just a crack before he dies. He looked at me directly and he said one sentence, just one. After 84 years, after 50 years of ministry, after thousands of sermons and hundreds of funerals, and a lifetime of standing between his congregation and the question he could not answer, one sentence. He said, "I have been preaching to them for 50 years, and I have known since the very beginning, since the morning of my very first sermon, that there was nothing on the other side of the door I was asking them to walk through, and I kept on preaching. Because by then, I did not know what else to do with what I had become." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't even sure how to interpret what he meant. Whether he was confessing the truth or confessing his own spiritual emptiness, I still don't know. But the weight in his voice that night was impossible to ignore. He did not say anything else. He turned back to the window and he stayed that way, facing the light, for the rest of the time I sat with him. He did not ask me to pray. He did not ask me for forgiveness. He did not ask what I thought or what it meant or what he should do with what he had just said. He had said the one true thing. After 50 years, he had said it once, out loud, to one other person. And that single act of being witnessed appeared to be enough for him. I stood to leave nearly an hour later. I walked out into the corridor and I stood there, completely unable to put one foot in front of the other for a very long time. Because what an 84-year-old man had just placed in my hands was not a story. It was a question. The most important question I have ever been asked and I still, to this day, do not have an answer. He died 3 days later, quietly, in the night, alone. After hearing the stories of all 3 pastors, one question still remains. If power can corrupt faith so easily, how many other churches are hiding the same secret? 2 weeks after Pastor Samuel died, I submitted my resignation. I spent almost 2 years away from ministry in any form. I'm not going to tell you what conclusions I reached during those 2 years, because I do not think my conclusions are what this story is about. What I want to say is this: 3 men, 3 very different ways of carrying the weight of what they had built their lives on. But all 3 of them, in their final hours, needed exactly the same thing: to say the one true thing, once, out loud, to someone who would not leave the room. That is what I was there for. Not to judge them, not to fix them, not to pray away what had already been lived. Just to be the one person who heard the whole truth and stayed. I returned to chaplaincy work after 2 years. I am still doing it today. But I never sit at bedside the same way anymore. And I never sit in a congregation without remembering what it cost 3 men of God to finally tell the truth. I am not telling you these stories to shake your faith. I am telling you because these men deserve to have their truth witnessed by more than just one person. But I want to ask you one question before I go. And I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Which of these stories disturbed you the most and why? Drop it below. I read every comment. This is Dangerous African Confessions HD. We shall meet again in the next episode.